Ok, señores, bienvenidos. Estamos otra vez en un episodio más del podcast. Hoy un episodio muy especial. Jacobo, Paco, ¿cómo están?
Hola, ¿qué tal?
¿Qué tal?
Buenas tardes. ¿Cómo les va?
Tenemos aquí un invitado muy especial que vamos a presentar en un segundito más. Antes de eso, queremos dar ahí un par de anuncios. Paco, que no se nos olvide que tenemos ahí el concurso, bueno, no es concurso, pero una serie de actividades de el diagrama, el meme o el clip que nos pueden taguear. Ya nos hemos estado recibiendo varios, de los cuales ya hemos seleccionado 2 personas que van a estar con nosotros en un podcast para que se unan a la mesa de los caballeros del Rey Arturo, ¿no? También otro anuncio por ahí, no se los olvide, tenemos un roster muy grande de episodios. En este caso tenemos un invitado, como les hemos dicho, normalmente no tenemos invitados únicamente cuando son muy, muy especiales. Cuando hablamos de Luis Barragán, trajimos al arquitecto Juan Palomar. Cuando hablamos de Sorkin, trajimos a Alejandro Galvez, editor de Arquine. Y cuando hablamos de leyenda social, trajimos un arquitecto, Rubén Sepúlveda, que trabajó con Aravena en el proyecto social de acá de Monterrey. En este caso, traemos un invitado al que estamos súper emocionados de tener y súper agradecidos, que voy a ceder la palabra a Jacobo para que nos lo presente.
¿Qué tal? Pues muy contento por tenerlo aquí, doctor Raymond Neutra. Celebramos un año de podcast, de este esfuerzo titánico de estar por lo menos una vez al mes tratando de formular y elaborar estos perfiles. Me voy a permitir hacer una breve semblanza del doctor Raymond Neutra. Raymond Neutra es médico por la Universidad McGill en 1965. Obtuvo su doctorado en epidemiología en la Escuela de Salud Pública de Harvard en 1974. Ha sido profesor de epidemiología en la Universidad del Valle en Cali, en Colombia, la Escuela de Medicina y Escuela de Salud Pública en Harvard y la Universidad de California en Escuelas de Medicina y Salud Pública de Los Ángeles. Es coautor de un libro de texto sobre análisis clínico en decisiones cuantitativas, además de haber escrito más de 100 artículos. En sus investigaciones ha abordado distintos temas: la ética científica, la epistemología, la psicología ambiental, hasta estudios sobre la aplicación de la epidemiología para mejorar la salud de los ambientes. Para el podcast de Arquitectura y Filosofía es un honor contar con usted, doctor Raymond Neutra, para conversar sobre el legado de su padre, Richard Neutra, y para reflexionar sobre la importancia de los espacios saludables como tarea multidisciplinar y urgente por la condición o la crisis sanitaria en la que vivimos actualmente. Bienvenido, doctor. Bienvenido, Raymond Neutra. Espero se encuentre de maravilla. Para comenzar esta conversación, quisiera que si nos puede hablar sobre su trabajo, sobre sus investigaciones, si nos puede comentar a qué se dedica, los estudios que escribe, que investiga.
Sí, después de ser profesor en Universidad de California en Los Ángeles, serví como jefe de una división de epidemiología ambiental en el Departamento de Salud Pública del Estado de California. Y hemos hecho estudios sobre accidentes de químicos, sobre exposiciones en lugares de trabajo y por un rango de causas de enfermedades ambientales. Y también trabajamos con comunidades donde hubo varios grupos de intereses. Puede ser los empresarios que ha causado un problema de gente en la comunidad que ha tenido problemas y con negociantes que muchas veces no quisiera hablar sobre los problemas por temor de como digo, la reputación de la comunidad. De modo que hemos aprendido la importancia de intereses e ideología de varios grupos en la comunidad. Y eso siempre es un problema. Nos hemos visto en esa pandemia, ¿no?, que hay gente que no quieren cerrar los negocios, que, otros que son más enfocados en la salud y especialmente en los Estados Unidos esos puntos ideológicos es muy importante. Pero en México también es un problema, ¿no es cierto?
Definitivamente. Antes de saltar a otros temas que tienen que ver más con arquitectura y para la audiencia que nos escucha, la mayoría han de haber escuchado el último episodio donde hablamos de la arquitectura de su padre, que tiene mucho que ver en esencia en la salud en los espacios, que gran parte de su obra se dedica o se enfoca o se embebe en eso. Quería hacer una pregunta. ¿Cuánto tiempo, doctor Neutra, estuvo usted involucrado con el gobierno en el sistema médico, como comenta?
¿Cuánto tiempo?
Ajá.
27 años.
27 años con el gobierno de California.
Sí.
Y así nada más por los momentos en los que vivimos, ¿cómo ve como Estado cómo ha llevado la pandemia? ¿Cómo calificaría los esfuerzos del gobierno de California?
Sabe que la cosa es que fue posible de prevenir lo que va a pasar. Y aunque sabemos, ¿no?, que va a venir una pandemia, todavía aún en California, que tiene un programa bastante bueno, no hemos preparado suficientemente en muchos puntos. Por ejemplo, preparar de hacer muestreas de la población para saber cómo es how it's spreading and how who's being affected and so forth, and to prepare the infrastructure to give the vaccinations and so forth. It's frustrating to see. It's because we're human beings and we tend not to plan ahead and to imagine how things will be. Hopefully, we will learn from this experience.
So preemptive care, and it's not that bad, but we could have done better, is what you're trying to say.
Yes.
Y para nuestra audiencia, yo creo que aquí vamos a tener back and forth en inglés y en español, muy Monterrey, por así decirlo. Y vamos a subir este episodio en una segunda ronda, pero con subtítulos, para que no se preocupen, pero qué bueno que están aquí. Veo que hay mucha gente que nos está escuchando ahorita, entonces, genial. Jacobo, si me permites, quiero saltar el tema de ahora sí, y yo las preguntas las voy a hacer en inglés. Y Dr. Neutra, feel free to switch back and forth in Spanish as you wish. I have a book here with me, which ties into the first question that I want to kick this discussion off. And this discussion is very free, and feel free to go into any topic that you like and extend as much as you wish. Vienna. This book talks about the amazing cultural happening that it was in the time of your father's youth and your grandfather's times in this city and this part of Europe. An amazing amount of culture was being generated, and it was at the tip of modern at that time there. So it was a new culture that was emerging, which no doubtly has then had an impact in your upbringing. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit of how you see yourself now. Dr. Neutra, you're 82 years old? 82 years old, yes. So looking back, how was your upbringing different? Because your family came from, well, part of your family, no, your whole family came from Vienna.
Yes, my mother was Swiss, actually, and my father came from Vienna. He was Jewish, and his family had been part of an immigration of Jewish people into Vienna during the 19th century. So, in a way, he was an immigrant and an outsider, even within Vienna. And those Jewish immigrants were very important in that ferment of new ideas that you described. So, people like Arnold Schoenberg, and many of the other people, Freud, all these people were in a way outsiders. Now when we look back at Vienna, we look at those people, but at the time they were a fringe group of interesting people that the general population sometimes were even hostile to, because Adolf Hitler was also in Vienna at the time that my father was a architecture student, and Trotsky and Stalin were also in Vienna at that time in 1913. And just before the First World War, there was supposed to be a meeting of the Socialist Union. The Austrian Socialist Party was the most advanced one at the time, and they were going to welcome all the socialists to come and meet there. And then the Zionists also were starting at that time. So there was a lot of interesting things going on that suddenly came to an end in 1914 with the start of World War I.
Sin duda su padre, Richard Neutra, crece en un ambiente muy rico, muy estimulante. Se puede decir que es un caldo de cultivo, sobre todo de talante científico. Creo que eso es una gran diferencia si lo contraponemos con otros arquitectos que tendrían una base filosófica muy diferente, una base artística muy diferente. Aquí Richard Neutra crece con Freud, con también la misma, el Círculo de Viena, que son este grupo de lingüistas que van a querer establecer una base científica a la filosofía. Yo creo que lo hace también una figura con un perfil diferente, un perfil más, me atrevería a decir, un perfil más científico. De hecho, tomando en cuenta la biografía de Neutra, pues creo que también él participó en la Primera Guerra Mundial, padeció tuberculosis, entonces tuvo también, sufrió todos estos estragos del mundo moderno. Ya entrando en este aspecto, no sé si me permitas a mí, Viviano, preguntar.
Claro.
Ya que nos plantea este contexto, quisiera preguntarle, ¿cómo lo formulo? ¿Qué se siente ser hijo de Richard Neutra? ¿Cómo era ser un hijo no arquitecto en una familia de arquitectos? Y cómo fue eso también, aunado a esta pregunta, ¿cómo fue crecer en una casa de su padre, de Richard Neutra? Supongo que usted creció en la BDL Research House.
La VDL.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
BDL.
So I was a child of immigrants, right, and of very well educated immigrants with if you like, they came as they were unusual in Vienna, and they were even more unusual in Los Angeles. But because my father's office was in our house, and because, like my father, I was more than a decade younger than my next siblings. My father was 8 years younger than his artist sister, and he was probably about 14 years younger than his psychiatrist older brother and his engineer older brother. And so I, too, was 12 years younger than my brother Dion, who was the architect brother, and my oldest brother was maybe 16 years older than me. He had autism and was in our family until his early 20s. So I was around adults mostly, and I would wander through the architect's office and see the men on their metal stools with their T-squares and triangles. And it was a very international group of people. It was a small office, never larger than 9. And there was Sergei Koshin, who was a Russian architect who had taken Le Corbusier around Moscow in the 1930s and immigrated to the United States after World War II. There was Benno Fischer, who had survived the concentration camps and still had his tattooed number on his wrist. There were people from Colombia and Argentina, and so it was a very international group of people working in this small office. And then in the evening, I could eavesdrop on the client interviews in the living room. And on Saturday, I would be taken along on inspection drives to see buildings under construction. So, and my father was a very entertaining person who liked to share his philosophical ideas to this 10-year-old boy who was driving along in the car. So I knew what my father did, who he did it for, and who he did it with. Mm-hmm. And I could also see my older brother, who was working in the office, and I was taken in to learn how to draft myself, and it was pretty clear that I wasn't good at that. But I was very interested when in junior high school he published his book Survival Through Design, which was about how research in environmental psychology and neuroscience could be helpful to architecture. And so I decided that I would go into medicine, and my father was fine with that, and because somehow it related to these ideas that he had. And so that commitment to paying attention to how architecture really worked, and that you could maybe improve it by research and by paying attention to how it worked, was something that had a big impact in my own career.
You mentioned that your father was okay with that. I would have thought that he would be, I would have thought first that there would be, of course, a sort of a push to also be part of the family office, let's say. But as you say, when you learned to draft, it was clear, as you mentioned, I think you're being a little bit, what's the word? Self-deprecating, and saying that it was not clear. It was clear that you were not the best at drafting. But I would have thought that because of your father's inclination to health in design, that he would be actually quite happy for you to go the health route.
The closer I got into medicine, the more comfortable he felt with it. In fact, it took quite a while for me to find what aspect of medicine would fit for me. It happened that as a medical student, I thought of medical anthropology for a while. And I got a job as a medical student to work with a psychologist and an anthropologist on the Navajo reservation, studying how culture influenced the symptoms of hysterical patients, and compared that to the symptoms of epileptic patients who have a neurological organic disease as opposed to one that's formed by psychology. And that led me to come back again and serve my military duties on the Navajo reservation as a general practitioner. And I discovered epidemiology when they sent me off to a course on tuberculosis control. And suddenly I saw that was what was going to work for me, that there were two epidemiological projects they had us read. One was a study of the relative value of barefoot doctors delivering tuberculosis medication to Indian villages in East India compared to going off to sanitarium. And it was clear that it was cheaper, it was more acceptable for the patients to stay home and have someone supervise that they were taking their medicine rather than being taken away for 2 years. And that sort of fit into the same idea of evaluating whether something will work, and what is more cost effective, which sort of fit in with the same thoughts that my father had about evaluating architectural projects.
Which is one of the points that you outline in your abstract in this article of the journal TPJ. I want to switch a little bit now to architecture, but before that, I have to say that anthropology is very interesting because anthropology and architecture are so linked between the sciences and arts that go into creating shelter and the study of us human beings, right? I have a professor of mine. His son carries his office now after he passed, and he had 2 sons, and one became an architect and the other's an anthropologist. And it's hard to, if you meet them and you don't know which one's the architect, which is the anthropologist, it's impossible to discern. And I'm talking about Pablo Landa and Agustin Landa, of course, for our community over here in Mexico that know them well. Dr. Neutra, following this and now getting into a little bit of architecture, sort of to kind of tip our toes into the well of architecture designed by your father and your brother. The Lovell and the Kaufman House, I think we see them as the most published buildings. But what do you see as a son and as a speaker for the legacy as the most important project of your father's office?
Well, I think the one that, so the Lovell House is interesting because he never designed another building that was like that formally. And I can't say that anybody else did either. It sort of stands kind of alone. It's a very unusual particular solution. And it's kind of his first building. And in some ways, I've been in both his first building. I've actually been there several times more recently. And then I've been in the last building that he designed in France. And there's no question in my mind that I would rather live in the last building than in the first building. He believed in steady improvement, and there was steady. He learned things along the way, and things became more livable as things went along. But in terms of what his most influential buildings were, I would say probably his schools, which began, school designs began around the same time as the Lovell Health House in the late 20s, with the idea of indoor, outdoor, naturally ventilated schools with gardens attached to it, because he had experience as a landscape architect. His really first project was a forest cemetery outside of Berlin, which still...
Luckenwalde, is it? Yes.
Yeah, in Luckenwalde, yeah. So, and then he had the opportunity to really build such a school in 1935. And then in the early 40s, he had a chance to design a whole series of reinforced concrete schools in the island of Puerto Rico. And he wrote a book called Arquitectura Social that was published in Brazil. And that had a big influence on school design all over South America, and particularly in Mexico, where you can go in all over Mexico, you see similar kind of reinforced concrete schools that look a lot like these schools that were published in that book. So probably in terms of volume and maybe social benefit, probably those early schools and his continual publication of his schools and talking about schools was maybe his most constructive influence, I would say.
Jacobo, te paso la palabra, pero nada más quiero decir una cosa. Paco, creo que tenemos una foto de una de las escuelas que estaría bueno ponerla. Interesting how it's the schools, which are neither the first ones that you get up when you research Neutra. But that's really interesting to hear. Jacobo.
Me parece bien interesante que haga mención de esta otra faceta de Richard Neutra, porque regularmente nos quedamos con la fase glamurosa de sus casas de Hollywood, y donde pues entenderíamos como serían estas oportunidades para él experimentar, pero también tenemos esta otra parte, sobre todo en Puerto Rico, en los años 40, en plena Segunda Guerra Mundial, que realizará todas estas casas, de hecho con diferentes materiales, utilizando hormigón, por ejemplo, concreto armado, y donde justamente estos principios de ventilación, de espacios abiertos, la idea de una escuela jardín, que también va a influenciar mucho a arquitectos mexicanos como Pedro Ramírez Vázquez. Entonces, me parece bien interesante. De hecho, estaba leyendo hace días que hay una petición en la que quieren que no se derrumbe por parte del Docomomo de Puerto Rico, que no se derrumbe una escuela de allá, modelo Sabana, Lana, creo que se llama la escuela. Están luchando porque la escuela no se tire, sino más bien se remodele, se rehabilite. Pero se me hace muy interesante esto, que recuperar esta dimensión social de la obra de Richard Neutra.
Perhaps, quizá, también la obra más reconocida por el lado arquitectónico no es la que menciona el doctor Neutra, pero también no hubiera sido conocido para poder realizar esa obra. Entonces, muy valiosa. Aquí vemos una imagen de uno de sus schools, ¿no?
Corona School de los 30, me parece.
Exacto. Dr. Neutra, I have the follow-up question to this would be one that I prefer Jacobo to ask because it's really in his field. Jacobo, yo creo que tú preguntes lo de las influencias primero.
Ok. Creo que la figura Neutra es una figura bien interesante porque es una figura nodal, es como un puente entre generaciones, que curiosamente quizás también estaría interesante que abordar eso, porque a veces no se reconoce tanto a Neutra como debería. Digo que es un puente porque está entre esa primera generación de arquitectos, digamos, Frank Lloyd Wright, Hilder, compartió también de él, y luego están sus alumnos, Soriano, por ejemplo, cómo va a influenciar a las casas de estudio, y se puede decir que Neutra es quien inventa el estilo, vamos a llamarlo así, el modernismo californiano. Me gustaría en concreto preguntarle cuál cree que sea la mayor influencia para Richard Neutra. Creo, doctor, para mí sería Adolf Loos, aunque se lo conoce más como un alumno de Frank Lloyd Wright. No sé qué nos pueda comentar al respecto.
Yeah, I think that both my father and Rudolf Schindler, both of them were students of Loos. Loos used to have evening workshops, and they would discuss philosophy and so forth at the cafes. Both Schindler and my father were enthusiastic about Frank Lloyd Wright from the Wasmuth portfolio, and Schindler went in 1913 and escaped World War I. My father was caught in World War I and didn't come until 10 years later, 1923. But he clearly looked at Frank Lloyd Wright in his pre-1910 phase as a way to the future that would link nature and technology. And in the the Wasmuth portfolio projects, Wright was still in a very linear and machine-friendly phase of his work, which fit in with the commitment from Adolf Loos of simplicity, no ornamentation, and certainly no attempt to imitate historical styles, which of course Frank Lloyd Wright also was not doing. But Frank Lloyd Wright had this kind of linkage with nature, and maybe even more interest in technological innovation. Wright had designed some prefabricated houses, and if you look at the strategies that Wright talks about in his summary of in 1930, he sort of summarized where he had been, his 8 points. It maps almost perfectly onto the strategies that my father used, with the horizontal line, the integration of the mechanical systems into the design, and all those issues. Except he's doing it in a more stripped down, unornamented way than Wright did. And he continued to acknowledge his respect for Wright, maybe not as much as he should have, his indebtedness to Wright. And also there was an indebtedness to Rudolf Schindler, who really at the beginning had an even more radical relationship of indoors and outdoors, starting with his 1922 King's Roadhouse, where my father lived for 5 years, working with Schindler. And I think both of them and the whole California school owes a tremendous debt to Frank Lloyd Wright's earlier work, not so much to his Mayan palace phase or to the more I would say decorative almost phase of some of Wright's later work, such as the Marin County complex, for example.
It's kind of space age. This, of course, is Frank Lloyd Wright pre-move to California, well, to Arizona, pre-move to, let's say, the West Coast. It's also Frank Lloyd Wright pre-tragedy, of course, that we know happened over the Taliesin East. I want to be careful with that next point because I don't want to mix up other subjects that we also want to talk about, like Schindler and other stuff. But the relationship between inside and outside, speaking about Wright and his early phase, I remember Wright giving Philip Johnson a hard time with the relationship between inside and outside. You mentioned that your father's work, if you take Wright's summary of his 8 points, are completely in line. So they're sort of like mutually referencing each other's design ethos. And I'm sure that the influences go both ways. You know, we like to talk about, for example, the Baroque in Mexico as there is the work of the Spanish architects that came over to conquer Mexico, but they also get influence back because of being with the native work in Mexico when they go back to Europe. So you can see the counter Baroque as it went back. So I like to believe that influences work both ways. But I wonder if you ever heard or knew about Wright giving your father a hard time with regards to this comment that Wright made with the Philip Johnson glass house. The comment is that Wright comes into the glass house and says, "Philip, I'm confused. Am I inside or am I outside? Should I take off my hat or not?" I don't know if you can provide any commentary to that.
Well, I wrote a book which is actually in Spanish as well as a Kindle book that your students can get for $3 at Amazon called Barato y Endeble,
Yes.
Neutra y Frank Lloyd Wright. And Barato y Endeble is what Wright called the Level Health House, cheap and thin. Mm-hmm. So this happened after 1932 when my father was in the Museum of Modern Art show on the international style, and Wright was only included as sort of a precursor, but represented as not somebody that was active. And of course, after that, Wright had a resurgence and a wonderful career with Falling Water and with the Johnson Wax building and other buildings. The glass house in some ways doesn't really integrate indoors and outdoors because it is a box and functionally it's all inside, but you see outside. In the work of Schindler and Neutra in a temperate climate, and also similar works that you see in the Pedregal in the 40s and early 50s, where I think there's a influence. Max Seto actually worked with my father in San Francisco. You see a functional relationship between indoors and outdoors, which is particularly important for the smaller Neutra houses, where the square footage is low, and yet it becomes much larger when you open those big sliding glass doors. And Schindler really was the one who did that first. So the I trace that relationship in my book with the 40 years of correspondence, with the final one just before Wright died, saying my mother sent him a record of her song. She was a musician, and he responds and then says, "And greetings to the clever Richard." Indicating
resourceful.
Well, it's sort of clever has a kind of sneaky. Yeah. I don't know what the Spanish word would be.
Would it be like a smart aleck kind of thing?
Yes, or conniving.
Conniving. Okay.
Kind of flavor to it. That in the same letter he says that Richard would have done better to acknowledge his indebtedness to me, which to Wright was important, but it was a good point. There's a deep indebtedness to Frank Lloyd Wright.
We'll circle back to that. Let's promote that book. Paco, puedes buscar ese en Amazon, la versión en español, barato y
endeble.
Endeble. En inglés es cheap and thin. Esa es la versión en inglés. ¿Cómo?
Bien. Creo que como sabemos bien, o como lo cuenta la historia de la arquitectura moderna, hay un debate sobre dónde se origina la modernidad arquitectónica. Siempre ponemos como las coordenadas en Europa, pero hay otros autores como Raymond Neutra, que a lo mejor probablemente lo conoció, dicen que en realidad el origen está en la misma California. Creo también, tanto por Schilder como por la casa Lovell, Lovell House de Neutra. Creo que, sin afán de ser muy crítico, creo que la búsqueda de Neutra es una búsqueda distinta a la de Frank Lloyd Wright. Ahorita menciona la idea de naturaleza. Creo que la idea de naturaleza en Frank Lloyd Wright es muy estética, muy visual, y mientras que el Neutra tiene una base mucho más científica. Creo que piensa más en términos como Loss pensaba esa arquitectura, como una especie de arquitectura ética. Creo que a veces se nos olvida que cuando hablamos del uso de la tecnología o la implementación de la tecnología en la vivienda, hay que entender que una vivienda de principios del siglo XX no cuenta con un baño, no cuenta con electricidad, no cuenta con servicios. Entonces, esto de la máquina de habitar, que es un término que se ha malinterpretado muchísimo, pues quiere decir en realidad una casa que cuente con servicios, que los servicios estén integrados a la casa, que la cocina sea una parte de la casa y no esté afuera, que el baño esté dentro de la casa, que pueda contar con servicios hidráulicos, de gas, etcétera. Esto creo que habría que marcar esa diferencia. De hecho, ahorita que mencionan a Philip Johnson y la Glass House, pues es más bien una casa de carácter iconográfico, más bien se podría leer en ese sentido, pero creo que su padre Richard Neutra va en otra dirección muy distinta, o sea, va en la búsqueda de una casa saludable, más que una casa natural, una casa saludable en la que se puede integrar el ambiente, donde elementos como la ventilación, el uso de las terrazas, el tratar de integrar el jardín, pero creo que tiene creo que le quiere dar más una funcionalidad, y esa funcionalidad lo vemos en la salubridad, o la funcionalidad en Neutra lo entenderíamos más como la salubridad. De esto que menciona, y quisiera que si pudiera, porque esto yo no lo conozco, pero a esto que digo que es un puente de generaciones, si usted podría darnos alguna información sobre la relación entre Richard Neutra y Louis Kahn. Si conoció a Louis Kahn, si intercambiaron cartas, conversación, no sé. Y quizás está interesante también lo que nos cuenta esto de Max Cheto, que visitó California, y esto de las casas del Predegal. Estaría también interesante que pudiera mencionar ahí un poco más sobre esta relación o este encuentro.
My father did know Louis Kahn, and both of them were together in a study of creative architects by the psychology department of University of California, Berkeley in 1958. Pierluigi Serraino has published a book about it, and interestingly, each of the architects were supposed to rank the, so I have to stop here. The psychologists wrote to deans of architecture schools in the United States and to editors of architectural magazines and asked them to give them a list of the 40 most creative architects in the United States in 1958. And of course, the different lists didn't all have the same names, but the 40 that appeared on all the lists were chosen, and my father was chosen as one of them. Frank Lloyd Wright had just died, so he was not there. And I think Mies and Gropius, for one reason or the other, were not declined. But Louis Kahn was there, and Philip Johnson was there, and a number of other people that you would assume. And 10 of them at a time were invited over a weekend, which they spent taking psychological tests. And then they chose 40 random members of the American Institute of Architects who were not on that list, and gave them the same test to try to see if they could see what the differences were. And one of the things that they asked was that each of the creative architects should list the 40 on their list in terms of who they thought were the most creative. And interestingly, Louis Kahn put my father as number 1. Which would be surprising. My father's list was not found in the archive. I don't know, perhaps he didn't complete it or it was lost, so we don't know. But I know that he sort of was, he recognized Louis Kahn's creativity, but he was not very sympathetic to architecture of the grand gesture. And when he was asked which was his most important work, he said, you know, you can't judge one of them, that they represent a continuum of effort, so it should be, but then when he was pushed to it, he said that he chose the Kaufman Desert House because it represented his ideal of an architecture of assemblage, of taking existing industrial elements, which were then put together in a way, and creating an oasis in an environment which was essentially hostile. It was the closest he could get to building something on the moon. Where he was responsible for creating a biologically optimum environment using technology that was available. Now, the technology that was exciting in 1927 and through 1948 tended to be steel and glass and a variety of features such as lighting, and there's been an article written about how much attention he and Edgar Kaufman put to the indoor and outdoor illumination of that building, and how the internal illumination had to be low enough so that you could look outside at night and see the moonlight and the external lighting. So I think what characterizes his legacy is continuously paying attention to what is industrially available and assembling it into a artful environment that is healthy and delightful and accommodates what people do and how they socialize, and then their well-being and their health. And calling out that brief to himself, it's the brief, it is the commitment to the problems to be solved that is the true legacy, not so much his particular solution, way of solving the brief, because of course that's going to change on the moon and on Mars, and it's going to change. As we now know, we have to start thinking of materials that don't cause 40% of the CO2 emissions to the planet, which steel and plastic and concrete do.
It's going to change as our Earth changes. Perdón, Jacobo.
Decirlo sencillo, la aportación de Neutra está en traducir las condiciones de la industrialización de los nuevos materiales en un ambiente saludable, como lo ha mencionado, en un ambiente que sea interactivo, conexión con el exterior, la importancia de la iluminación. Y es interesante el juego de valores que maneja Neutra. Ya que estamos, le preguntaba por esto, creo que si quiere podría desarrollar un poco más la influencia de Richard Neutra en Latinoamérica, si nos puede contar un poco más sobre lo que hizo en Puerto Rico. Entiendo que es un asunto también de planeación urbana. En el último podcast también se mencionó que tiene una casa en Venezuela. Entonces, ¿qué nos podría contar al respecto, doctor?
There's a book which Professor Catherine Rose Edinger has written about this in Spanish, and the Neutra Institute has provided some assistance, and I've written an introduction to an English version of that. Starting in the late 30s, my father started having contact with Mexican artists Siqueiros and Rivera, and both came to California, and my father had interactions with them when they were in Los Angeles. And then in 37, he visited Diego Rivera and his wife, who took him to one of the pyramids. And so that there was a connection then, and he was aware of what the Spanish modernist architects were doing. And then after this Puerto Rico experience, he was invited in the Good Neighbor policy to tour various countries in South America, and in Argentina, and in Brazil, and Uruguay, and Peru, and Bolivia, I think. And then later he had a number of visits in Colombia in the 50s and into the 60s, and to Brazil as well. And he was widely published there. Part of his role was that he was a great networker, and my mother, who was very important in his career, was in charge of all the relationships with the various architectural magazines, and he would write something in English, and then he would propose that it would be translated into Portuguese or Spanish and published there. So he was, and it worked backwards again. When he came back from South America, he was very impressed by the variety of sun control devices, and he wrote an article about and publishing the work of Hardoy, for example, and then adopted these vertical louvers in his own way in the Kaufmann House, and then in a number of his buildings, including the second version of the Neutra VDL studio and residences in 1963 that my brother and my father rebuilt after it was burned on the same prefabricated foundation. So and arguably he was influenced by the integration of murals and artwork, and in fact he saw that I'm blocking on the Burle Marx, who was a landscape architect and muralist. He made sure that Burle Marx did a garden on a project that he did in Cuba, and then Burle Marx did a mural on a trade union building in Los Angeles. So there was a lot of connection with colleagues in South America.
I want to backtrack a little bit more because I think we'll touch up on South America again before we finish. I think it's fascinating that Khan marked your father as his most creative person. I think I remember listening to a podcast that spoke about that research. They were trying to figure out if you could actually generate the circumstance to generate creativity, and there was a study on these architects. I remember listening to that podcast. Now, but we've been talking about influences, both of like artists, which I had not heard of. This contact with artists that you're speaking about is not the typical stuff that is written about, that at least I have been researching on your father. Frida and Diego Rivero were not in my scope of what I had found so far. I don't know, Jacobo, ¿tú has encontrado que haya conocido a Frida y a Diego Rivera?
Un poco. Hay un libro que no he podido localizarlo, sobre, que se llama Richard Neutra y el Sur. Uh-huh. Es un intento, una labor de investigación donde quieren documentar la labor de Neutra en Sudamérica y en México. Okay. Y sí tuvo mucho contacto, como bien dice el doctor, la obra de Neutra era muy comentada. Uh-huh. Y tiene también un impacto en Pedro Ramírez Vázquez, en algunos otros arquitectos.
Soriano y demás, ¿no?
Soriano, sí. Pero sobre todo en el caso latinoamericano, parece que sí llegó un momento de mucha influencia, mucho contacto, mucho intercambio más bien de ideas.
Uh-huh. Pero nos soltamos un poco porque quiero hablar de Schindler y clientes. Entonces, remontándonos un poco, going a little bit further back, Dr. Neutra, Schindler, as you spoke, escaped First World War. Your father was caught in it and actually was had to be convalescent for a while afterwards, recovering from that war, before he could go back. Before he could immigrate into the U.S. But they kept in touch through letters. In a way, Schindler must have been an introduction point to the U.S. and to Wright. And of course, as we know, then there becomes this issue of the Lovell House, which Schindler was engaged with the Lovell family for a couple of houses. And this house that we just spoke about, the Neutra Lovell House, becomes one of the most important in your father's oeuvre in the whole work. Now, I want to understand the relationship and what happened to Schindler, because for us as architects, Schindler seems to be a bit of a forgotten figure, but I don't think it's because of, the idea is that he's forgotten because he wasn't widely published enough, and that was on purpose. If we dig in a little bit into the projects that he did, the stuff that he did under Wright, and the stuff that he did as his own architect, obviously there's not a lot of work, not as prolific as, for example, your father. I wonder if you can provide some comment on why was he not more prolific? Why couldn't he get more work? How does your father eventually end up with the Lovell project? How did the client find about your father? did your father and Schindler collaborate in? Are there projects where they're both involved in? Could you shed a little bit more light? A lot of it's put onto Philip Johnson's list of that show that you mentioned in MoMA in 1932, where it's seen that they, yes, you mentioned that Wright was put in like sort of like the grandfather in the background, but it's understood by our generation of architects that Schindler was snubbed from that list for a reason, which we don't know why. I don't know if you can provide any comments to all that.
Yeah. So with regard to the 1932 project, Philip Johnson and Hitchcock had made a tour in Europe of modernism, and they were most attracted to the more cubist kind of work, and favored in particular Le Corbusier and Mies and Gropius and Out. And in 1932, when my father went back to for the third Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, CIAM, he comments that the Dutch architects had been very influenced by Wright in the pre-World War I era and just a little after, but now they were going more towards Le Corbusier. And so, for example, the MoMA thing, I don't think had the Zonnestrahl, for example, project, which is, you can see Wright's influence, and some of the more Wright-influenced modernists in Holland, and similarly, Schindler didn't fit this particular formal characteristic of some concrete and steel and glass. He was more like Wright in that way, and so he didn't fit. And there is a letter where Schindler tries to get into the MoMA show, and Philip Johnson answers him and says, "Well, I'm sorry, you don't quite fit, but if you can show me some of your other work, you could." So that's part of it. Then with regard to the relationship between Schindler and my father, Schindler was maybe 3 or 4 years older than my father. So if you can think back when you were a freshman in architecture school and the senior guy seems way ahead of you. Mm-hmm. So the relationship between Schindler and my father was the enthusiastic freshman who looked at Schindler's work, which was quite radical in Vienna, and he sought him out, and they were enthusiastic. And the letters between my father and Schindler are Herr Schindler, Mr. Schindler.
Mm-hmm. Respect.
Yeah, and also a more formal relationship of Viennese people to each other. But it was one of great gratitude that my father would write him even during the war, and would acknowledge how much it meant to him that this older guy who had actually was working with Wright would be writing him. And it was through Schindler that my father started writing Wright, and hoped that maybe he could go to Japan in the way that Antonin Raymond actually did go to work with Wright there, and that never worked out. And it was only, and these letters would go back and forth, and Wright was in Japan or Wright was in Los Angeles, and Wright's life was in complete chaos at that point in the early 20s, and it was only at Louis Sullivan's funeral that they finally met face to face, and then Wright invited my father to come to Taliesin to see it, and there was some conversation about whether he could come and work with Wright. And when my mother came over in 1924, she came straight from Ellis Island on the train with my father to Taliesin. So there was a transition from Ellis Island to Taliesin was these two young people who hadn't seen each other for nearly a year. That was their true honeymoon, was at Taliesin. And there's wonderful letters from my mother describing that trip, and later they came back and lived there for nearly 5 months and were there when Olga Ivana first showed up at Taliesin. And so then there was really no work. There was a couple of jobs that fell through, and then my father was invited by Schindler to come to Kings Road, because the Chases had left, and there was an apartment there that my father could rent. And my father was working for an architect in downtown Los Angeles and writing on his book Vibaut America that my mother was typing up for him. And then my father decided to quit his job and work with Schindler on a project for the League of Nations. And Schindler was kind of had other work that he was doing, and he was also sort of not getting involved until the end. Then he did get involved in that project. And at the same time, my father was trying to get jobs for commercial projects, because meanwhile my father had gotten his license to practice architecture, which Schindler didn't do until a couple of years later. And so the idea was that my father would work with Schindler on commercial projects, and Schindler would continue on his own residential projects. And he involved my father as a landscape architect on the Lovell Beach House, and on some work that they did up on the Hollyhock House. Mm-hmm. And so Lovell was familiar with my father and was familiar that they had a partnership, and he was getting frustrated with Schindler because Schindler had designed a beautiful mountain cabin using innovative Celotex material, which melted then under the snow. And he was also probably aware that Schindler was carrying on an affair with Mrs. Lovell's sister, Mrs. Friedman, who had a house by Frank Lloyd Wright. And Lovell did not like Mrs. Freeman. She was a difficult character who kept mixing in on things, and he didn't want to have Mrs. Freeman interfering with his new house in the city. And so he turned to my father and said, "Look, you're the partner that I want to take on this project." And my father was dismayed by this problem, because Schindler had been nothing but nice to him, and he tried to convince Lovell to let Schindler be part of the design team. And Schindler was kind of reluctant to get involved because he had sort of had a falling out with Dr. Lovell. And finally he sort of agreed, but then soon after he kind of Schindler dropped out of the project, and my father took it from there. But but Dr. Lovell knew that Mrs. Lovell really had wanted Schindler to continue, and when Lovell dropped out, when Schindler dropped out of the project, Lovell did not tell her. And my father sensed that he wasn't supposed to talk about that either. And so Mrs. Lovell discovered it only when she talked to Schindler about it, and she kind of held it against my father that somehow Schindler wasn't involved, and Lovell was not going to take the responsibility for that. So but this all happened in the summer of 1927, and my father continued to live and work there through 1930. And I think there was then a fallout between my father and Schindler, particularly after 1932, where he felt that he was being displaced by these architects that were following what he called the international style and the more regimented kind of way of doing architecture, industrial kind of architecture, which he did not believe in. Every building was a new one-off thing. And he characterized my father as more an engineer than an architect.
Oh. Sí, estoy entendiendo bien. Sí. Podemos decir que Schindler tenía un carácter más difícil que el carácter de Neutra.
Una persona complicada.
Una persona complicada. Además, por ser mayor a Neutra, cuando llega a Estados Unidos, pues tiene una relación distinta con estos arquitectos. Digamos que Neutra llega más en plan de alumno o discípulo, más adaptable a integrarse, digamos, en la comunidad de arquitectos. No tenía una posición, digamos, tan fuerte como la podía tener Schindler. Y a lo que comenta, Neutra colabora en la casa de la playa, en la Lovell Beach.
El paisaje.
En
el paisaje.
El paisaje, que es de hecho también de lo que se le reconoce, y que al final es más bien es un asunto de talento, o es un asunto de adaptarse a las ideas o a entenderse con el cliente. De hecho, aquí hay una lección interesante de Neutra, ¿no? Neutra como alguien que sabe como que leer al cliente y termina convenciendo al doctor Lovell, y por eso hace la famosa Lovell House en las colinas de Hollywood. Si estoy entendiendo bien o resumiendo lo que comenta doctor Raymond, entonces podemos decir eso, que Neutra tenía una ductilidad o tenía una flexibilidad, quizás un trato mucho más flexible, y que eso le permitía poder integrarse mejor en estos círculos y hasta cierto punto dominarlos, porque va a terminar desplazando a Wright, o Wright prácticamente va a terminar, no quiero decir la palabra asqueándose, pero sí distanciándose del estilo de vida que se está formando en California, en Hollywood, Palm Springs, etc. Sí, Viviano.
Sí, totalmente. Yo quiero tomar esa línea porque es por eso, is this why, Dr. Raymond, that we're sort of discussing that perhaps Schindler's a more complicated individual. Your father is a bit more, what would be the right word, more efficient with his client dealings, perhaps not mixing business and personal as well. So is that why Schindler was not so prolific? Did he encounter these kind of problems with other clients? It seems that there's also this thing that, if you mentioned that after 1932, it came to really a head where he was being displaced or set outcast or not included into the club, then that kind of ideology might promote oneself to even distance oneself even further on purpose.
No, well, first of all, I would not at all say that Schindler was difficult with his clients. His clients loved Schindler, and Schindler was very ingenious in accommodating client needs. I think it was that after 1932, the editors of architectural journals there was kind of, what was a la mode. And in the United States in particular, with Philip Johnson, it was like a fashion show, really. And Schindler was extremely creative architect, and he was a very apparently, I only met him twice in my life. Once when we bumped into him at a movie show as a little kid, and once as a teenager, where I met him in that famous hospital room thing where the two of them by accident showed up, my father with a heart attack and Schindler with the cancer that would kill him off within a year. And so I saw him in the hospital bed. But apparently he was a very jovial, charming, relaxed, playful kind of guy. My father was much more driven and business and intense. He could be very entertaining, but he tended to be kind of the center of attention. My father, well, apparently Schindler was friendly and fun to hang out with. You more the typical Viennese in that regard. So I think it was merely that he was going in his own direction, which was not a la mode.
Right.
And he did very few commercial non-residential projects, and that may have reflected his ability to do larger projects, although conceptually he was a great designer and very original. And so he was, I think, bitter against my father, partly because he disapproved of where my father was going, which was trying to develop almost a vernacular kind of design that was scalable to many different kinds of projects and would be economic and easy to do. And so, in fact, he became easy to imitate. And towards the end of my father's career, then his work was looked at as not so creative, because if you define creative as being different from other people, well, you could never say that about Schindler. He was every new project was unlike anyone he had done before, pretty much, and certainly unlike anybody else was doing.
I have to say that hearing this, well, not firsthand, but from secondhand from you, that we're in this environment, it's absolutely amazing. It brings stuff that we've been learning from as students of architecture and as researchers of architecture to life. And I want to plug how we came to you was through PJ Litovsky, the director of this upcoming documentary on your father's work, which should be out soon. And Paco, I think we can put up a slide that shows the cover of the documentary so that everybody out there can go ahead and look for it and set reminders so when it's out. We've been speaking about Philip Johnson. I think this is something important that I particularly want to come across with this. We mentioned a little bit in the last episode. Dr. Neutra, we're going through, culture's constantly reinventing itself and evolving, and I think it's always for the better. We learn from our mistakes and from the mistakes from the past. But in the States, in particularly, worldwide, but in the States particularly, we're living into a bit of a PC culture where it's even hard to sometimes debate ideas because there are intransigeable positions. So sometimes people just rather not discuss anything. And there is a little bit of a revisionist history going on. And for me, it's particularly worrisome when it comes to architecture, when we want to sort of sometimes erase individuals. And I would like to just hear your opinion, because in schools, younger people are trying to avoid or erase the history of Philip Johnson for stuff that I have seen him in video and in written apologize for. You mentioned that your family are immigrants even since Vienna. My family background, Villarreal, is Sephardite Jews that were expelled from Spain. which are now being reappropriated. That's one half of my family. The other half is Prussian. That's the Buren part. So I find it very hard to believe. Philip Johnson apologized many times for his, let's say, liking to fascist ideologies while he was living in Germany. But it seems that young academics right now are focusing only on that and trying to then erase the 75 years of life that he did after that, I guess, repairing what he then got indoctrinated into. So I just find it that we need to speak to the full life and not just the mistakes. And I wanted to get your opinion on Philip Johnson and how some young people are trying to kind of erase him from history for these reasons.
So Philip Johnson started as an architectural historian and then studied architecture and became an architect. And he played a really important role, certainly in my father's career, not only because he included him in the 1932 show there, but he also, when my father came back from Europe, got him a job designing aluminum busts with his father, who had owned part of a bus company. And the money that my father got kept him going through the early 30s. And so he was somebody that consistently supported the respectability of the experiments that people in the Bauhaus and then later at Harvard were doing, where Philip Johnson got his degree. He was he disagreed with my father's focus on the performance of architecture and the experience of people, and then famously said, "Richard, that's not architecture."
He would say that to a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, and I think my father would have disapproved of his sort of stylistic. He would have thought of him more like a fashion designer than taking the full gamut of what an architect ought to be committed to. And in fact, Johnson's firm did a lot of sort of iconic brand making things for big corporations, right? Which wouldn't be where my father's heart was. And with regard to this thing of saying, well, we're going to erase people for bad behavior they did, rather than being curious about whether that bad behavior had any relationship to their subsequent work. I haven't read a lot about Johnson and what it was about German fascism or Spanish fascism. I mean, Italian fascism, and how it fits into his worldview. So I can't comment. But just as a general thing, I'm against erasing people. I think that my tendency is to look at behavior that is bad in other people and say, there, but for the grace of God go I. That all of us have this capacity for going in a direction that is harmful to the community.
Of course.
The more curious I am about it, and more understanding, the less likely I am to make the same mistake.
That's very wise advice, of course, to learn more of why a person did what they did. No, yeah. I agree with that. Jacobo?
¿Te parece bien si hacemos las preguntas finales?
Sí, I think we can start to wrap up. We're going to get to the health in spaces and to the institute, and that's where we will end.
Yep.
Jacob?
Que si nos puede, número uno, pues si nos puede dar una reflexión sobre la evolución del concepto de salud. Creo que hemos hablado de eso. Si nos puede dar más palabras al respecto de este famoso del biorealismo, que creo que es el concepto que aporta Richard Neutra, esta idea de un espacio de satisfacción fisiológico y psicológico. Y si pudiéramos concluir, que nos comente su labor en la Fundación Neutra, su fundación, su trabajo, y sobre todo también esta situación que me parece interesante, que es el patrimonio en torno a la obra, o la patrimonialización en torno a la obra de Neutra, que creo que también es un asunto importante. ¿Nos puede comentar?
Creo que va a compartir. Dr. Neutra, you want to share your screen?
Yes, and I just, let's see. Oh, come on. Oh, okay, wait a second. I'm missing a W here. I'm trying to pull up the website because I just... Here we go. I just want to show you the website of the Neutra Institute for Survival Through Design. It was something that my father started in 1962 with the hope that his name would attract money to support neurological and environmental psychology research. And that didn't work out, and after his death in 1970, my brother took it over, and it was more about the preservation of the Neutra legacy in the way that let's say the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation or the Alvar Aalto Foundation did. And then when my brother died a few years ago, he left 3 Neutra designed apartment buildings in the Silver Lake district of Los Angeles, and a substantial amount of stocks and bonds, so that now there really were some resources, and the estate is still being settled, so that we're in the process of thinking through how to proceed. But this is the website, and it has things about my father here, and my brother and my mother, who were part of this. It also has our missions, which is promoting current research and responsible design, and then providing interpretation and stewardship of the Neutra legacy, and to use it to advance this first mission. And then it will have a project gallery. These are the 3 buildings that we have the stewardship of. But eventually we will have all the non-residential projects here in a searchable way. And the U.S. Modernist website has hundreds of residential projects there. And then we have a thing of resources. We have some webinars. This one here is a presentation of Dr. Barbara Lamprecht about brain science and research. This is research and responsible design webinars, and then stewardship webinars. This is one about the restoration of a community at the Painted Desert. And then I have one about how, in fact, this place that I grew up in really always accommodated multiple households, and who those households were and how it worked. And this is a little film interviewing some previous collaborators and clients. And this is something about this particular place that is one of our stewardship things. So there's that. And then among all the resources, there's a linkage to all the 15 archives that you can find information about Neutra. And Neutra books, Neutra movies, and then this particular website has a lot about Siqueiros and Rivera in California. So if you go to the website, you'll get a lot of information. John has done a lot of research there. So that, stop share here. Then I'm going to share again. Let's see. I wanted to say that my father's legacy for most architects is related to these beautiful residences. This is the Kaufmann Desert House. This is a house in Switzerland with a spectacular view. And I should say one of the things that's interesting, if you look at my father's work, is it's unlike many of the other early modernists, the photographs are mostly of the exterior, or if it's of an interior, it's mostly about what's going on inside. While often in the Neutra, even the earliest ones, you see how nature is related, is the main feature, which is certainly the case in this particular house. But my father was interested in affordable housing, starting with this 1927 reinforced concrete garden apartment with, even on the upper floors, some ability to be indoors and outdoors. And the VDL Studio residence, which was built in 32 and then part of it burned in 1963, was from the beginning an experiment. It was on a 60 by 70 foot lot, and the idea was that you can imagine a young couple who are working from home on their computers nowadays. There would be one couple that would live in this part, another couple in this part, and they would share a kitchen and a dining room. And downstairs there would be another couple and another couple that would share a kitchen here and would share the bathroom with, during the day, would be the office. And here's a picture of that office. Here's Sergei Koshin that I described. This is my brother Dion, my father over here, and here is Benno Fischer. And then when I was born in 1939, another unit was built, creating a patio with this big sliding glass door with an indoor-outdoor functional relationship. And one of the rooms had been was permitted as a car garage, but in fact it was supposed to be a playroom for me, which I learned to take guests around and push with my hip and flip open this garage door that opened onto a very shallow little garden, separating it from the sidewalk outside. And here's my two grandchildren looking at a model of this building as it was then. And in my youth, we lived down here. This was my little room, and this was my playroom there. And here was the office, and a spinster lady lived in an apartment over here. And upstairs, the family of a man named Frank Wilkinson, who started public housing in Los Angeles. And this was in the late 40s. So 3 households and an office all on the same tiny little lot. And there were 12 doors to exit the house. So all these people could be there and not get in each other's way. This was an apartment house in 1938, another apartment in 1938, garden apartments, a 1942 garden apartment with outside spaces, and public housing. This was a project outside of Dallas, Texas, in which all the units were prefabricated for workers at a airplane factory, and it was a cooperative, so each of the workers then owned a part of the cooperative and managed it, and to this day it is still functioning there as a cooperative in the depths of Trumpian Texas, and it has I think the last original owner died a few years ago, but many of them are owned by children of the original workers. And then schools, as we discussed, this in 1936. This was a drive-in church for...
Dr. Neutra, sorry, because we're seeing the blank screen at the moment.
Oh, all this thing is...
Oh, there we go. There we see the church now.
Okay, so this was a church where people would drive in like to a drive-in movie, and Reverend Schuler would come out on this pulpit and speak to these people on a microphone. There were people inside and outside at this drive-in church. The Los Angeles Hall of Records with its giant louvers, adopted from the work of Hardoy in Buenos Aires and his building there. This was a child guidance clinic for children. And so these are our three buildings in that we're responsible for: the Neutra Museum of Silver Lake. We almost have another assignment here. My wife is reminding me. An art gallery that is in there with garden apartments at the back, which we're just redoing now. And this is a triplex that my brother Dion designed with garden apartments. And his own residence had this little studio apartment with indoor-outdoor possibilities. So that was built above this garage. And the original building was speculatively built, but it was called the Reunion House because the elderly parents would be living here, and the children and their grandchildren would come to visit and be separated by this living room so that the visiting children could come and go. And this is the background that you see here of what this living room is like. And in fact, my brother ended his life there in a hospital bed, and his wife is now in hospice care there, so that it accommodates a whole trajectory of life, including an invalid life in this place. And one of the projects that the Neutra Institute is doing relates to the Neutra legacy, of trying to use the legacy to advance research and a kind of creative design that serves humanity and the planet. So this is the UCLA Laboratory School that Neutra and Alexander designed in 1958. It's a indoor-outdoor campus with gardens and landscaping, naturally ventilated, naturally illuminated. And the research arm of a big architectural firm is in negotiation with us to come and do a post-occupancy evaluation of this nearly 65-year-old school to see how its uses have evolved over time, and how it might have functioned with COVID because of the natural ventilation, how it's performing, what its carbon footprint is, and then how it might be, how its life might be extended because it's getting very hot in Los Angeles. And so that to use this particular attempt as a way of thinking about how schools can perform and how they could be perform in the future. And this is how we hope to use the Neutra legacy in many ways to advance and help people that are working with the same kind of commitment to using technology in a way to accommodate what humans do, how they socialize, how their health is done, and yet with an idea of the carbon footprint and the future, using other technology, but with the same kind of humanistic and ecological commitments.
Dr. Neutra, I'd like to commend you and your family for all the work that you're doing in the preservation and the communication of this institute, and all the team that must be working with you together on this effort. It really is a monumental effort, what you just shown with the website and all the activities taking place. This post-occupancy analysis, I think, is very critical in many aspects of architecture. And what a great way to do it in the aspect of health, kind of really analyzing a building from a scientific point of view and how design affects. And can we measure that in a scientific way, I think is very valuable. And, you know, showing your brother's ending of his life is, I think, very moving. So I can only really extend my full appreciation for us, from our side, of you sharing your time with us. I don't know, Jacobo, if you want to conclude with something.
Después de la vasta explicación del doctor, yo creo que queda muy poco que decir. La página es genial, o sea, a nivel de acervo, que es sumamente necesario. Es toda una invitación a buscar más sobre Richard Neutra. Creo que la obra de Neutra es invaluable en la búsqueda de un espacio saludable, de espacios abiertos, de espacios de interacción, que creo que hoy en día son más que nunca necesarios. No sé si podamos agregar algo más, ¿no? Cerramos.
Yo creo que podemos cerrar. Neutra.org, Dr. Neutra, again. Muchísimas gracias, Don Neutra. Nuestra apreciación por este tiempo, y va a ser de mucha ayuda a toda la gente que nos escucha. Una pregunta para concluir con usted, Dr. Neutra. Your advice for any architecture student that wants to focus in health in space design, what would be your one advice?
Listen to the client. And there are some wonderful books out there. A recent one that I'm very enthusiastic about is by Lisa Heschong, called Visual Delight in Architecture, talking about the importance of light and view on chronobiology and health. Very interesting. I've got to go. I've got another interview.
Okay. Dr. Neutra, thank you so much. We'll speak to you soon. We appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ok, jóvenes, nos quedamos aquí nada más nosotros y wow, ¿no? Increíble, ¿no, Jacobo? No nos queda más que asimilar todo lo que escuchamos de, como lo dije, de segunda mano, no es de primera mano, pero segunda mano, de toda la vida alrededor del arquitecto Neutra, ¿no?
Así, ya después de eso, ¿qué dices?
Exacto. Bien, nos vemos para el siguiente podcast, es el número 20. Tenemos algo especial, no tan especial como esto, pero como quiera, continuamos con temas especiales. Paco, por favor, ponnos en pantalla qué es lo que vamos a hablar la siguiente sesión.
Sí,
Paco.
¿Qué les pongo?
Tenemos ahí uno de los últimos slides que te enviamos. ¿Recuerdas? Es un premio. Exacto. Vamos a dar el premio Pritzker y vamos a dejar que ustedes participen con nosotros. Entonces, vamos a pedir que ustedes nos digan, taguenos en Instagram con un arquitecto una arquitecta o arquitecto que les gustaría que hablemos, que tenga el premio Pritzker. Vamos a hablar varias cosas alrededor del premio, pero ustedes pueden decir cuál de algunas cosas podemos concentrarnos subiéndonos ese tag de Instagram. Y no se les olvide que continúa el tema de que ustedes entren con nosotros al podcast a dialogar con nosotros, subiendo un meme, un diagrama o un clip. Yo hubiera esperado más diagramas. Este diagrama de Schulman está hermoso, pero han sido muchos memes, pero todo es válido. ¿Jacobo?
Sobre todo que nos traguen diciéndonos cuál creen que es el premio más merecido y cuál creen que es el más discutible. Para decirlo de la manera
pero
más...
incluyen el nombre de la persona que se le adjudicó el Pritzker, ¿sí? Entonces...
El que crean que es el más merecido y el que crean que es el más discutible o el más polémico.
Así es. Entonces, con eso concluimos y estamos nos viéndonos en 2 semanas. Jóvenes, hasta luego. Chao.